So this is the 1911. This video is going to go through total takedown down to the last little part and how to put it all back together. I'm not going to really talk about the function or the why. We're just going to go over the names of everything, where it goes, how to get at it, and how to put it all back together when you're done. So without further ado, beginning of things with the field strip. The slide stop lever, always lock the slide back into that larger notch. Make sure the slide gun is clear and empty. There's more than one way to do the field strip, and it can depend on the type of recoil system that you have. You'll notice that no recoil rod visible with the slide locked back. This has got a half-length recoil rod. That was the original design. It actually had a functional purpose to it, which was so that if you only had one arm, you could actually rack the gun against the heel of your boot, but it was not as stable as the full-length recoil, so most match models today have a longer recoil rod. The first thing we want to do is to actually remove that recoil rod system to get rid of the spring pressure, and we do that by pressing down on the recoil spring cover, which is this piece here, and then we're going to rotate the barrel bushing out of the way. If you're looking down the barrel of the gun, you're rotating it counterclockwise. If you're looking down the barrel, then you're rotating it clockwise. So you push in and you'll be able to turn that to one side. Keep pressure on this finger because this is a 15 to 18 pound spring, and you don't want to send this shooting across the room, especially because not all of them are captivated at all. Some have a mechanism of holding the spring inside the cover, but this is the pointy end of the spring. The back end is always going to have a flat coil, unlike the front, which is left pointy because it's expected to be held in, covered. So that's the recoil spring and recoil spring cover. The barrel bushing can now rotate to the other side of the gun, at which point it will slide out. And what's going on there is this this raised area on the barrel bushing is actually what has to cross in the area between the top of the slide and the bottom of the slide. It's exactly that width, so it only can come out when it's rotated to that side. When you rotate it around to the other side, it's actually got a groove that you can't see on the inside of the slide that locks it into. So when this is all the way in place and it's rotated here, it can't come out of the gun. The only place it can come out is when it's on that side. So now that we've done that, we've taken off that big spring pressure. It's going to be a lot easier to move the barrel around. And that's important because first thing we want to do is line this half moon notch, not the slide stop notch, but the actual half moon takedown notch. And we're going to align that with the the back of the slide lock itself. So you bring that to the very back, and the reason that we're doing that is because we can't actually see the back of this piece. It's behind the slide, being held in by the slide, and this is one of the only places that it can come out of the slide. So once we're there, we can slide it all the way out. If we look at this piece, now that it's out, if you look at it from the side, the part you could see is only up to here, and then the slide is where my thumbnail is. When it's out all the way, what you can see is that crescent there, that's on the other side of the slide metal normally, and that's why you have to line it up with that notch to give it clearance to come out of the gun. So that's what's holding the slide and frame together, and so we can now slide the slide off of the firearm. At this point, the recoil rod, like I said, this is a half-length rod. You may have a full-length rod. Can come out of the firearm. The barrel itself does not lift up like a Glock or most other tipping barrels. This is a link-locked barrel. The link itself is what was holding everything together with this pin through it. you want to knock the link into the forward position so it can clear the front of the gun and you actually bring it out the front. It cannot come straight up and out. If you try and pull it out, you're going to have a bad day. It's wider than the bottom of the slide. So if you don't flip the link over, you might have clearance, you might not. If your link is sticky in an up position, you can get it stuck in there. So the easiest thing to do is flip it forward and your barrel will come out. Now the link pin and link can come out, but you don't want to ever take them out unless you're actually actively replacing it. Most are peened in at some level to keep them from falling out when you don't want them to. And really it's not a part that actually rotates. The link rotates around the pin, but the pin itself never moves, so we don't want to create any slack in it that we don't have to. And it's pretty easy to clean around here with a firing pin if we want to. Some notable points for cleaning: make sure the locking lugs are clean, inspect them for signs of wear. If they're getting rounded, then you're getting some wear between the slide and the barrel. The hood, the little notch in the hood is a loaded chamber indicator. You can basically, peek in there and see the reflection of brass. Like all firearms, cleaning the chamber is more important than most people realize. Many feed problems are a result of the round entering and getting stuck on crud in the chamber. Rounds do not slide up the feed ramp and go gently into place. They bounce really hard, once off the feed ramp, once off the hood, and then they slam in there. It's very easy for a round to get caught in a 3-point bind where the breech face is pushing it forward, the bottom is caught on the feed ramp, the top is caught on the grime that you didn't clean off of the inside of the chamber. Obviously cleaning the rifling is important for the gun to last long and shoot straight and well. The crown, more important than anything else. Where the rifling ends is affects the round exiting the barrel. If there's too much debris, dirt, carbon fouling there, the gases will not escape evenly and the round will get kicked off and begin to tumble. So that's your barrel. I'm going to put the frame aside for a second while we dig in to the remaining parts of the slide. This is the 1911 A1. It is not the later models that had a firing pin safety. You'll notice there is no firing pin safety here, as I'm pointing to what's not here. If your gun has a button here, there's a few other parts. I'll do one of those models another time when I go over the Kimber. This is the basic one. So fewer parts to deal with here. We have the extractor that we're going to get out, the firing pin itself and the firing pin spring, and the back plate. The back plate is holding in both the extractor and the firing pin. So to get the back plate off, we're actually going to take a punch and push in on the firing pin itself and then lift the back plate off. Now, if we lift it all the way off, the firing pin's going to launch, so get ready for that. Put a finger behind it, whatever. Pop the back plate off and catch the firing pin. The firing pins have some variation. Usually there is an end that is got a slightly tighter coil, but not always. In this case, there is. This end is a little bit wider. This end actually stops before the very end. So the end that's tighter is the back, and that lets you affix it in place so it doesn't fall out. The wider end is to make sure it retains clearance as it's getting compressed. Again, when taking these off, whenever you're putting springs on or off, if you rotate against the direction of the spring, meaning you're essentially unwinding it, that loosens the pressure on the spring and will let you take it on and off easier and save you some wear and tear on the spring and some parts. If you turn it the other way, you're tightening the coils of the spring and you're fighting against yourself. So remember, you're trying to make the spring a little bit wider as you take it on and off. The remaining part is the extractor itself. The extractor, the back of the extractor, visible here. Now sometimes your extractor, if it's depending on how the fitting of the gun went, it might have perfect clearance and go in and out without any problems at all. Other times you'll get it partially in and it's going to stick. And the reason is the extractor claw up here doing its job, hanging on to rounds, may end up protruding in past the breech face, and depending on how much tension has been put on it, it may actually catch the breech face. So it's hard to emulate that if it's not set up, but essentially it can get stuck right before it goes in. If that's the case, just gently push the extractor back until you can pull it out. You don't want to spin this around if you don't have to. Just gently lever the extractor out of the way till you can get it out. This looks like I think this is an aftermarket one that got replaced, and I never put a bend in it because it had adequate tension. Most extractors will have a slight bend between the middle and the front, or an even slighter bend between the back and the middle. That's what this middle bit is for, is to provide a levering point where you can put a bend in there to create the right amount of tension on the actual claw end. The groove in the back is just where the back plate went through the firearm to help hold it in place from coming out of the gun. And that's it. There is nothing else in the slide. Again, when cleaning it, look for wear on the lugs in here. It will tell you who's been winning that fight. If the barrel's not quite fitted right, you'll have extra wear and rounding on the locking lugs. Other than that, clean your rails, clean your breech face, clean any debris out of here. This cut is for the disconnector, so it needs to be clean and well maintained, or your disconnector won't function. Reassembly is the reverse. It's very straightforward. I'm going to slide in the extractor, put the firing spring back on the firing pin spring, and rotate it so it's all the way on in the back. Slide it in, and the biggest challenge on putting it together is that you've just simply got to line these parts up. The extractor can go in a little too far, not far enough. It can be rotated slightly to one side. If you can get a punch in there to move it around, sometimes that helps get it in place. Now the next problem you have to overcome is the amount of tension here, and essentially the fact that you've got to push that spring in long enough to get the back plate on. Now if you look at your back plate, one side is going to be flat and one side is going to have this curve to it. The curve is the bottom side. That's the part that's going to actually push the hammer back as the slide goes back. So it's one of the ways you can remember it, is it has a rounded edge as it meets the underside of the slide. So we're going to get that started a little bit and try and get the firing pin in with my big fat fingers far enough to hold it in place, and switch over to a punch, and then use the punch to get it the rest of the way in and slide it down. The firing pin will pop back out the hole when it's all the way in, and that will hold everything else in place. That's the entirety of the slide. So I'm going to set the slide parts, the upper parts aside for a second, leave them in the field strip condition, and come over to the frame. Obviously my fancy zombie grips, which I got out of the bargain bin for I think $4. As far as I can tell, they don't seem to create any improved damage against zombies over regular grips, and they're just cheap plastic, and they cracked relatively easily when I over tightened one of the grip screws. You'll find all manner of different grip screws on 1911s. Every vendor every year seems to decide they want some slight variation, and there is kind of a reason to that. These screws do not go directly into the frame. They go into bushings which go into the frame, and that means that they stand off a larger distance, and it allows for different widths of grips and all other types of customizations. But in the end of the day, what it means is sometimes you'll find screws, sometimes you'll find Torx screws, hex head screws, anything you want. These ones are a hex head, so an Allen wrench, and they should pop right out. It is important not to over tighten these screws. You are not tightening them into the frame, you are tightening them into a bushing which goes into the frame. The bushing has far finer threads and can get stripped. Once you have the screws off and you lift this off, You see the actual bushings. Never take these out unless you are replacing them. They should not come loose because they should be Loctited in place. If they do come loose, it means somebody goes cheap on the assembly of the firearm. If you just shove a regular screwdriver into those gaps and try and screw it back on, you might not destroy it, but you might. There's an actual tool for it. A lot of times screwdriver sets that have these, hex tools, they make one that also has the head specifically for that. I highly recommend it because it lets you get that perfectly centered and doesn't give you any risk of slipping off and damaging the inside outside threads or anything. It just gets the right depth at the right height off of the firearm. So again, don't take these off unless you're replacing them for some reason. The threads on them are very fine. You have to clean them out very well from the old Loctite, re-Loctite them. Often the frame gets damaged when this happens because somebody didn't know what they were doing, or if they simply over tightened an actual grip screw and then stripped the bushing out. Now you've ruined your frame to a degree, and so they sell oversized bushings, which you have to tap a proper hole for. It causes more problems than you want to deal with. So best answer is don't over tighten these, and you won't have to worry about your bushings. Obviously, the same is true for both sides. So before we get further in, the next thing we want to do is get at the mainspring, and there are different retention mechanisms that are built in to different mainsprings. I'm pretty sure that this one was lost. I got this gun at a pawn shop, so it did not always have all of its parts, even when it was new to me. So the first thing you want to do, though, is relieve the pressure on the mainspring. When you strip the slide off, you will have cocked the firearm. So again, making sure the thumb safety is off. Catch the hammer with your thumb. Don't just drop the hammer with the slide off. It's not good for the hammer. It's not good for the frame. And one of these is significantly more expensive to replace than the other. So with the hammer all the way forward, we've now released as much pressure as we can off the hammer spring inside here, which means this pin, which is what we're taking out next, should be a little easier to go after. Traditionally, this pin has a rounded side and a dimpled side, so that you hit the dimpled side so that you don't damage it. And the rounded side is kind of more decorative than anything else, but it does mean that if you're left-handed, you'll tend to always put it in from one side versus the other, and that's the important part. Is don't hit the round side with a hammer if you don't have to. I don't have a particularly good block handy right now because I'm in the process of cleaning up the armory, so I'm just going to tap that to get it started. Now, the tension that's holding it in is twofold. One, there's just the pressure of the spring pushing the entire hammer housing down, and that pushes against the pin. But also, if you notice, this pin has a groove in the middle. Most of the hammer springs are not just sitting in there. They actually have a base which comes to a point that sits in that actual groove to keep that pin from drifting left and right, and to make it ever so slightly harder to take out. So one of the things you can do is put a little bit of pressure on it, and that'll make it easier to release. And again, hang on to these parts. They're under significant spring tension. So when you do this to yours, you might find that it only comes out a ½ inch and then the spring is retained. This one actually has a mechanism which could do that. This hole here could have a little pin in it that would do that for us, but it was lost and I've never made a new one. So in this case, the whole thing comes out, and what you have here is the cradle that the hammer strut goes into. You've got the actual spring itself, and then, as I mentioned, the pointy end at the base of the hammer spring is what actually rides in that groove, holding the whole thing together. So hopefully you've got one of the nice friendly ones that the whole thing stayed captivated. I wasn't so lucky. This is a locking mechanism, so that comes and goes model by model. I don't know where the key is for this one. If I had, it basically is just a very thin piece of metal with 2 points to grab that and rotate. What that would do is, if the hammer were compressed and inside there, it would rotate itself in there so that the hammer spring couldn't be any more compressed and couldn't come up, effectively disabling the hammer from being all the way cocked or obviously fired for the same reason. So next part that we have to take out is the thumb safety itself. The thumb safety goes through the frame and through the hammer safety and comes out the other side. Because of the way it works, it's a Sear blocking safety. Safeties all operate in different ways. They tend to be named based on what part of the gun they get in the way of. So firing pin safeties stop the firing pin from coming forward. In this case, the thumb safety is a Sear blocking safety. It stops the sear from coming out of engagement with the hammer. The grip safety is a trigger safety. The grip safety stops the trigger from being pulled backwards. So all of the three possible safety mechanisms on the 1911 actually block different parts of the gun's operation. So now that the slide is off, if you put the hammer in the cocked position, you'll be able to, he said, just before he got it all stuck. Did I mess this up? There we go. Sorry, that was my grip safety actually getting in my own way because I didn't notice I had pulled the trigger and gotten it wedged on the top of the grip safety. Put the hammer into the cock position and you should be able to operate the thumb safety. It will come out somewhere between the safe position and about halfway on, so you really just have to grab it and wiggle it back and forth as you're lifting out, and it will start to walk its way out the side of the gun. Don't force it because you'll tear up the parts that it's actually engaging with. Just like I said, wiggle it, gently walk it out. It will come out eventually. The grip safety pretty much falls out at that point, and if we shake it around, the spring, the leaf spring that controls tension on everything but the hammer, normally sits in there. It locks into a slot down here at the bottom with this little curved piece. One leg of this spring sits on the back of the Sear. One leg sits on the back of the I'm sorry, I said that backwards. One leg sits on the Sear, one leg sits on the disconnector, and the third leg that's bent over backwards is actually the one that pushes the grip safety out of the way. So it's one leaf spring that actually does three different things. Most of the adjustments for trigger pull and everything about what is adjustable in this gun is done right here with adjustments to that spring. The spring that puts pressure on the thumb safety is also the same mechanism that puts pressure on the slide lock. They are two pieces of metal that should be held together by the spring in between them. It's not easy to see on film, but if you have one of these that's properly made, there should be a couple things notable about it. One is, if you give these a gentle tug, they shouldn't come out. They should be fairly tightly attached to each end of the pins. The smaller pin is the forward end, the larger pin is the thumb safety end. The spring itself actually has a tiny kink in the middle. Do not try and straighten it out. It's there for a reason. When I slide this in, everything is freely moving right up until the kink of the spring goes in. It's a little bit wider than the hole, so it keeps it from falling out on its own. It's supposed to do that. It's to keep you from losing your parts when you're taking it apart, so don't lose that. There are two pins left holding the hammer and safety system. They, if properly made, will be relatively flush with this side. And you can see them, in this case, I have rounded ones that protrude out the back. Most are set to protrude ever so slightly out the back to give you an easier way of getting them out. A little gentle pressure, it lifts up, and they're easier to get a fingernail under at that point. So the larger one is the hammer pin. So when you take that out, the hammer pops right out. The smaller one is the Sear pin, and that's going to be around the Sear and the disconnector. If you have a model with a firing pin safety, it also goes through the firing pin safety mechanisms. Depending on which type of firing pin safety, that actually may involve both pins. There's different models with different safeties. The easiest way to get the safety and disconnector out is to simply shake them out. That's these two parts. This is the Sear itself, and this is the disconnector, and the Sear sits there and hangs on to the hammer just like this. Put it all together for illustrative purposes, and this is what all these parts look like when they're doing their job inside the gun. When you pull the trigger, you're pushing on this bar, which is actually the disconnector, which, since this is a magnetized punch, makes that a little hard to demonstrate. You push on the disconnector, which pushes on the tail of the Sear, and since it can't, it's going to rotate around this pin. That's going to push the whole thing forward. The pressure on the hammer now lets it rotate. There's one of the legs of the leaf spring is always pushing back on this. So when the disconnector gets pushed down, that allows the Sear to pop forward again, so that when the hammer comes back, it'll catch it. And then the other force on the leaf spring will then push the disconnector back up into place as the gun cycles forward. Again, we don't have to get too terribly much into function. Just want to keep aware. The big pin is the hammer pin. It goes with the hammer. The little pin is the Sear pin. It goes with the Sear and the disconnector. The other remaining parts are the trigger and the magazine release, and the magazine release is holding the trigger in. This, again, usually tends to be a small flathead screw, but sometimes I've seen them as small hex heads. What you're going to have to do is push in on the magazine release about halfway, and as you're doing that, you'll hit a point where you're able to rotate this counterclockwise. Don't force it. If it's not going, it means you haven't pushed it far enough, or you've pushed it too far. So again, when you're doing that, it's gentle. If you push the thing all the way and go in there, you're not going to be able to turn it. Also remember that it's counterclockwise to take it apart. So usually it's about halfway through the magazine push, or magazine release push, and then you rotate it. And what you've done is easier to see once it's out of the gun. Once that screw is rotated, it will come right out the far side of the gun. And if you look, you'll see that there is a spring. There's the piece that you turned, and then there's a groove in the magazine release with where that little rod has ridden over. If we hold this together and turn this back, we can find that these pieces come out. So the magazine spring and the magazine retention pin come out like that. And what we were doing, as you can see, when they're just in their regular position but in the firearm, it's doing two things. One is it's free to push the magazine release back out till you push it in again, and two is this piece is actually coming beyond the edge of the magazine. Beyond the edge of the magazine release, which means it's actually riding in a groove in the frame itself, which keeps the whole thing in place. So what we did by rotating it counterclockwise was to wrap it around so it's completely contained inside the body of the magazine release, which lets us drop it in or take it out without any undue difficulty. So just so we can say we took it all apart. At this point, your trigger should be free to come right out the other end. If your trigger does not slide all the way out freely, it's not the end of the world. The most important part is the very end of the trigger stroke. So if you hold the gun upside down and you're tapping the trigger up like that, it should always be able to go all the way back and fall under its own weight. If there's anything obstructing it, if there's grit in there, or if it's not fitted right, that's not going to happen. You're going to push it back, it's going to stick, it's not going to come forward. That's going to translate to very significant problems on how it feels. This particular trigger is got an over travel screw, in this case a hex head screw, a small hex wrench in there, and basically that's just controlling, you know, how soon does it bump into the frame. So you always want to make sure that's adjusted so that the gun can go off and then go another 1/16 of an inch beyond that, and then that stops any over travel beyond that. That's it. There's no more parts left. That's the complete disassembly of the firearm. So for reassembly, it's more or less the reverse of that. When you're thinking about these parts, trying to figure out is this upside down or not, sometimes it's important to think about how they react with each other, how they sit inside the gun. This angle, that's wrong. That all is going to line up with the way the frame sits. So when we slide the trigger bar in, when that sits in there, what we'll see is that piece is flush all the way down with the rest of the back of the frame. If we put it in upside down, it wouldn't be like that. It would create a huge ledge, or not go in all the way at all, depending on the make of your trigger. Some triggers do go in upside down. So again, make sure that you're paying attention to that, and that it goes in so that it's laying the same angle as the rest of the back of the firearm. Your magazine release has to go back in to be able to hold the trigger in place. So do the same thing we did while it was in the gun to unlock it. We're going to rotate that counterclockwise, quarter turn, slide it into its little hidey hole. Again, with your finger on the other side, pushing it out about halfway. You're going to start to rotate it clockwise till you find that groove again, and it'll start to turn, at which point you turn it the rest of the way and it pops back into place, and your spring is now doing its job, and the trigger is also retained. The next set that we need to get in place is the Sear, the disconnector, and the Sear pin to hold them in there. Now, if you're not familiar with exactly how and why these parts work, looking at them is not necessarily intuitive to know, is this upside down, is this backwards? And the learning a little bit about their function will help you keep that straight. This part is called the spade, and it rests, the flat part of the spade rests literally on the back of the trigger bar. The back part of the spade that's at an angle, that's where the spring is going to rest, and it rests there because its whole job is to push the spade upwards. So that's why the disconnector is angled. Is this middle leg of the spring will push on that, and since it's at an angle, that the net force results in the disconnector moving upwards when that spring pushes down, and that's what we want happening, is the disconnector being pushed back upwards whenever it can go upwards. So the flat of the disconnector touches the back of the trigger bar. That's why it's broad and flat. The angled part is what the spring pushes on. So that's half the battle, the disconnector orientation. The next is the Sear. Shouldn't be a ton of rocket science on the Sear part, but sometimes forgetting which is the top and bottom is important. It's going to come to one side which is far more pointy than the other, and the other side's going to have legs on it. The side without the legs is the side that's going to work with the hammer. So the whole thing is kind of coming around this same circle, and that's the small part there is what actually engages with the hammer. The legs down here work with the disconnectors. So if you put it this way, obviously it's never gonna, no part of this Sear is going to ever be able to hold that hammer back. So the pointy part is up top, and that's because it catches the hammer. And the way these parts sit is the one sits inside the other. This has a big large square hole because while this pin goes through it, it does need to be able to still move up and down. This Sear, however, just rotates around the pin, so there's a smaller hole. If I turn these sideways, the disconnector also lies inside the Sear. So that's how they actually sit when they are together. Which means that if you're trying to put it together, sometimes that's an easy way to hold them, depending on how big your fingers are when you're trying to line them up. This hole at the top of the frame here, that's going to have the head of the disconnector is going to be poking out that hole. So when you're putting these in, that's really what you're aiming for, is if you can see the hole, that's where the disconnector has to go. So I'm going to take these parts, aim, and drop them in place and get them as close as we can. Now I've kind of missed a little bit, so just take any tool that we can to nudge them up and try and get that in place. Depending on how badly I missed, we might just start over. I missed pretty badly. Let's aim a little more carefully this time. There we go. So a little bit better, and I can tell it's a little bit better because that flat of the spade pointing at the angled side, but again, it's where the trigger bar is. It's leaning right on there. And now what we can do is look in through the side and essentially nudge the other parts over to where we can actually see the hole all the way through them, and use just a little bit of careful alignment to make sure that we can get all the way through there with the punch, which lets us get them more or less lined up for our pin. And the pin is again going to go through both the Sear and the disconnector if we do it right, which means afterwards, if we shake it, nothing should be able to come out. If we look in, we should see that the Sear can rotate around the pin, and the disconnector, if I push it here, can pop up and down, and if I push the trigger back, it also is pushing on the disconnector. So that's everybody in its place where it belongs. The hammer and hammer pin is quite easy. Slide the hammer in, line it up with the hole, and its pin goes through. The real challenge is to not let these fall back out. You'll never hit these with a hammer. There's never any force required to get these pins in or out. That's why they're made flush with one side. That's a very delicate rim that puts on it. You don't want to mess it up. The thumb safety spring goes back in, and remember, once you're past that middle point, it'll get a little tough. And the leaf spring itself is probably easiest to put in next. And what we want to do is, if we just line up the bottom first and get it in that slot and try and put it in, we're going to run into the frame. The longest leg here is what's actually going to push on the trigger, excuse me, the left leg of the Sear. And really, to get this in there, we have to kind of get it inside the frame first and then lower it into position. So again, we're going to just hold the hammer tail out of the way and make sure that we start this. We're not going to be able to come in from the bottom, so start it in there a little bit, then look for the slot in the frame and drop it completely. And that it'll sit in there. Now it's going to flop around a bit, but really we want to make sure that we can see both of these legs doing what we want them to do. So the middle leg should be on the back of the disconnector, and the leftmost leg should be on the back of the Sear. If they're not, if one of those is under the other pieces of metal, take the spring out, put it back in properly. The gun's not going to work. It's going to cause you some headaches. So we can bring the tail back down, and now we're going to put in, we're going to cheat. One of the things that will make this easy is something to hold down the leaf spring a little bit, because it does want to flop around and pop out. If we slide the hammer spring housing in there, we don't want it all the way up to the point where it's going to actually engage anything. We just want to hold the springs under a little bit of tension so it doesn't fall out of the gun. We will, get to the details of getting that in proper place, but right now its whole job is just to take some of the pressure off or put some pressure on that leaf spring so it doesn't fall out on us. The grip safety, again, remember, was held in by the thumb safety, so you have to put both of these in at once. And if you recall, we can't, the safety can only be engaged if the hammer is in the cocked position. So once again, you put the hammer to the cocked position, you put the grip safety, you don't need to actually put the grip safety in the on, it just has to line up with its hole, and you'll be able to get this started. And remember that it's got this big end that's going into that window, so you can't get it too far till you have to actually line it up. And the first thing you'll notice is that this spring on most guns tends to pop out a little bit further than we want it to. So we need to take something small, the smaller screwdriver you have, or a small punch. If you have something plastic that's non-marring, even better, but you're going to need to push that out of the way as you get this in there. And then once you get close, again, you're going to wiggle that on and off, and it'll eventually snap into place. And now the grip safety is held in, the thumb safety's in. We really just need to make sure we don't let that leaf spring out of our control, and we have to get the hammer strut and the hammer spring all lined up. So again, if you have one of these that's completely captivated, then bully for you, make your life a lot easier. But what we have to do here, there's one thing I'm going to do. It's cheating a little bit, which is line this up so I can actually fire it. So what I just did was I lined up the grip safety and the trigger and the hammer strut so that I could actually simulate a firing of the gun to get it into that forward position, which means I won't have to push as hard to compress the hammer spring. So double check the leaf spring to make sure it is still in its little slot there. If it's come loose, you've got to get it back in and adjust it. As you guide this on, this is important, that little cup has to get a hold of the hammer. If that misses the hammer, it's not going to work for anybody. So it's going to take a good bit of force to get all this lined up and going. And the other thing is that this housing is also what retains the very back of the grip safety. So if I'm not careful and I just push it up, I'm actually pushing against the grip safety. So as I compress this, what I did with the punch is just line it up a little bit better so that it would actually go into the housing. But make sure that your grip safety is being retained by the housing when you go to put the pin back in. And again, you don't have to get the pin all the way in. As long as it's through part of the housing, it'll hold on to it long enough for you to get around to getting a punch. And again, remember, use the punch on the rounded end, the dimpled end, not the shiny rounded one. And just give that a good whack. And it should seat right in because there's pretty significant pressure to get it lined up with that center mark in the pin. At this point, the gun is essentially back together and functional. You don't want to drop the hammer on nothing, so safety check. With the grip safety not being pressed, the gun shouldn't go off. With the thumb safety on but the grip safety pressed, again, the gun shouldn't go off. With the thumb safety on and the grip safety depressed, now when we pull the trigger, the hammer should fall. I will cock it in and go through the rest of the safety checks after assembly. We can put our grip panels back on since we tested the functionality. Actually, while we've got it off, I'll do a quick crash course in how and why the disconnector works. So I'm going to simulate a shot. So I pull the trigger and the hammer comes forward. I'm holding the trigger still. So if the gun goes bang and the slide comes back and it cocks the hammer, what's going to keep it from going back forward again if I have the trigger pulled? Well, obviously the answer is nothing, but it's not completely true. What's actually happening is the disconnector here, the head of the disconnector poking out. When the hammer comes back, the disconnector can be pushed down, and you hear that click. That's the reset. Now, even though I'm still holding the trigger, when I let off the hammer, it's held back. So that's what the disconnector's job is to disconnect the connection from the trigger back to the hammer so that the hammer can be retained by the sear again. And what's actually pushing the disconnector down is the entire rest of the slide. This little hole here is where the disconnector sits when it's poking up, and the only time it can do that is when the gun is in battery. As soon as the slide comes back, that disconnector gets pushed down by the rest of this and held down until the gun is all the way back in battery, and that's ample time to have cocked it and held the trigger, or held the hammer, so when it comes back forward, the disconnector can pop right back up into its little crevice. But now, until you actually release the trigger and then pull it again, it doesn't go bang. So reattaching our fancy zombie grips. Again, remember, do not over tighten these. They just need to be snug enough not to fall out. If you over tighten them and you've got fancy wooden grips, they make wooden grips that cost as much as the gun itself. I have seen $800 wooden grips. Now, given you can pay $2,000 or more for a high-end 1911, but you're getting into the kind of the silly spaces unless you're a match shooter or a collector at that point. But again, if you like fancy wood from some lost Amazon rainforest that doesn't exist anymore, and somehow you've got the last chunk of it and you want to make grips out of it, go nuts. But again, if you over tighten your screws and crack them, don't come crying to me. So that's our frame reassembled. Get all over the slide. So as a field strip, it's a little messier than some guns. So what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total field strip parts. A Glock's got 4. But again, they're really similar. The recoil rod is arguably an assembly. And the barrel and barrel bushing, also arguably an assembly. And at this point now you're down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major pieces. So putting it back together, the barrel, again, make sure your link is forward so it doesn't get in the way, and slide it in from the front, and make sure that it actually does go in and seat when you do this. It'll make your life easier. The recoil rod, if you've got a half length or full length rod, it doesn't matter. You're going to put it in at this point, and the back of the recoil rods is almost always going to have this same horseshoe pattern, and where this crescent is, that's the part that leans on the barrel. So when you're putting it together, it's easy to screw up and get it halfway in, or God forbid upside down. If you're not paying attention, it's not going to go back together. It's going to cause you problems, and God forbid you hit it really hard, it gets stuck that way, and then you're paying an armorer to get it unstuck for you. So make sure that that part is against the barrel, and it's easiest to assemble it if you just push it all the way forward. It's going to fall back eventually, but it's easier to keep a thumb on it if it's in that position. So what we're doing at this point is getting the slide with the barrel and recoil rod back on the frame. So holding the recoil rod in with our thumb. Most 1911s are like this, all 1911s. The rails only come 2/3 of the way up the frame. Sometimes if you've got a 1911 that's got an undercut for a Picatinny rail, it tends to throw people off as an optical illusion, and I see people doing this all the time. The rail, the start to assemble where the rails actually are, and you'll have an easier time of it. Now what's about to happen here throws a lot of people, especially if they put the spring assembly in first and something is pushing on the link. If there's a spring or the recoil rod pushing back against this link, it's going to want to tuck it way back there where we can't reach it, because what we actually have to do is get our takedown pin to go through the frame and through the link. it doesn't actually go through the slide at any point. It's only holding on to the link and therefore the barrel. The slide is technically free to move around it. So we need this link to stay where we can see it. And so that one of the easiest ways to do that is to not have spring pressure on it. So we're going to take this back to the point where the recoil rod is actually, in place, and we're looking through the side of the frame as a window to find the link. And when we find it, we're going to go ahead and shake it around till we're sure we find it, put that in place. Now, this dangling loose here is fine for just getting it lined up, but where it needs to go is in its final hole here, which we can't do till the slide is in the right position. And again, that, if you remember when we started, is the half moon cut. So we're lining up the half moon notch with the big square notch in the frame. So that half moon notch in the slide should be right at the top of the big cut in the frame. If you see these scrape marks on this gun, they were all there when I got it, and most 1911s will have them, and they don't have to. If you do this next step right, you will not get these scratch marks. There are people who make special plastic tape for the careless just to avoid those scratch marks, but it all comes down to the same thing. There's two different approaches to it. You can use a tool, where again you're risking marring it if you don't have a plastic tool, but you can use a tool to hold the spring back out of the way as you try and put it together. Or you can actually use the part of the slide lock that was designed for it, which the slide lock has all manner of different cut surfaces on the back of it. All of them have a purpose, and the one that we care about is this top one right here. This panel is designed to push this spring out of the way during reassembly. So we want to make sure that we're lined up with the link. And what you're designed to do is you're putting that panel right on that pin, but from a little bit below it. And you don't push it straight in, you push it up and in. So when it's in this position, that's how you snap it in. If you try and come straight down on it, you're pushing against a different panel. The angles aren't right. If you're too far down, you can't get it to go. But if you have it lined up on that top panel and you push up and in at about a 45-degree angle, you're not going to scratch the slide. It's going to go straight in. You can't really miss and scratch the slide. That happens if you're going straight in or with slight downward pressure, and the result is the slide lock scraping its way down. So anyway, all the way through, and now we can bring the slide forward again. The barrel bushing goes in next, and remember the large dimple, bump in the bushing is going to go into the space between the top and bottom of the slide. We flip it around to the far side so it's locked in place, but gives us clearance to get our spring in there. Sometimes you might have to snug the spring in a few times to get it onto that recoil rod, and then the recoil spring cap goes on, and now again you're pushing against that 15-18 pounds of force, but once you've rotated that barrel bushing partially over it, it's going to retain itself from that point, and then you just continue to rotate the barrel bushing until it pops forward through it, and that's the complete reassembly. So the basic function check with the safeties off, as you rack it, you pull the trigger, the hammer should drop. Rack it again, pull the trigger, the hammer, and this time we're going to hold the trigger and we're going to test the disconnection. So I'm pulling and holding, hammer drops, I rack, the hammer stays back, I slowly release the trigger till I hear the reset, I pull the trigger again, and the hammer drops. That's the functional check. On a 1911, because you have two external safeties, you always have to validate that they work as well. So cock the firearm, put the thumb safety on, and try and shoot it. It shouldn't go bang. Take the thumb safety off, but don't push in on the grip safety. Trigger shouldn't go back either. But with both safeties off, gun should fire. That's the 1911, 100%. Hope you had fun. Leave me a like. Thanks.